Some memories stay with us because they explain things we could not understand then. Time moves quietly during childhood, so we rarely notice what it steals from us. We believed waiting was harmless because nothing looked different yet on the surface. Have you ever delayed something easy because it felt too easy to matter at all? It was a warm Saturday morning at the start of summer. Sunlight rested lazily on both our gates like it had nowhere else to go. I sat on the front step, drawing endless circles with a stick in the dirt. He stood near the fence, kicking a small stone like it had personally offended him. The whole street was quiet, which made everything feel safely unimportant and calm. My mother opened the door and called my name in her gentle way. She held a small brass key tied with a thin red string. The metal looked old and tired, like it would rather be sleeping forever. She said it belonged to the family who lived in the yellow house nearby. She asked us to return it sometime today if we could find the time. He leaned in close and whispered, "Is that a really important key?" I whispered back that all keys were probably important in some way. He nodded slowly and said, "Then we should not rush something like this." My mother smiled and said any time today was fine. Then she went back inside. He crossed his arms like an adult making a decision. See? Even she said any time. That sounded very official to me, so I accepted it right away without worry. We walked together to the edge of the yard and looked straight ahead. The yellow house stood there quietly with all its curtains closed tight. No shadows moved behind the windows, and nothing stirred near the door. He pointed carefully and whispered, "Look, there's no movement at the door at all." I squinted my eyes and asked what door. Movement usually looked like anyway. He explained that doors twitched just a little when people were waiting behind them. I stared hard, but the door stayed perfectly still and calm. "I think they're not ready for any visitors right now," he decided firmly. I nodded because the door really did seem unprepared for company. But secretly, I worried we might knock and they would stare at us strangely. Or we'd say the wrong thing and feel stupid. So we settled on late afternoon as a much safer, more professional time to visit. We celebrated this smart decision by throwing a crumpled paper ball back and forth. The key stayed safe in my pocket and tapped my leg every few steps politely. Each little tap reminded me we had an important delivery mission to complete. But then the neighbor's dog suddenly barked loudly and chased a squirrel right across our yard. We dropped the paper ball and ran after the dog to make sure it didn't get lost. By the time we caught the dog and brought it back, the excitement had pushed the key completely out of our minds for a while. We were too busy laughing and out of breath. Around noon, he glanced up at the sun and frowned in a very serious way. "The sun looks hot enough to be rude today," he said. I asked how sunlight could possibly be rude to a house or people. He explained that hot light made people uncomfortable when they opened doors. I imagined the family squinting in pain from the brightness. That picture felt possible, so I trusted his sunlight warning completely. We decided late afternoon would show much better manners, avoiding any uncomfortable moments. But right then my mother called us in for lunch. She had made fresh lemonade and sandwiches, and the smell was too good to ignore. We sat at the table eating and talking about everything except the key. Lunch stretched longer than usual because we started telling silly stories and competing to see who could make the funniest face. When we finally finished and went outside again, the key in my pocket felt strangely quiet, as if our minds had wandered off during the meal, too full and happy to remember the task right away. Late afternoon arrived slowly, moving like a sleepy animal waking up late. We sat together by the fence watching one big cloud drift somewhere important. He lifted the key high and studied it against the bright light. "The red string looks ready now," he said in a quiet voice. I asked how a simple string could show it was ready for delivery work. He answered that strings always knew things a little earlier than people did. I looked at the string again and felt truly impressed by its quiet confidence. "But dinner might be starting soon over there," he added thoughtfully. I pictured us knocking right when someone was chewing food loudly inside. "That would interrupt their bite?" I said seriously. He nodded fast. "Interrupting someone's bite is very impolite." Deep inside, we both feared the family might not smile or thank us. Or worse, act annoyed, so we put it off again to feel safer. So we settled on tomorrow morning as the socially safer choice. And somehow, that afternoon slipped away just as softly as before. We woke the next day with the same bright plans still glowing in our heads. He stretched his arms wide and remembered the key the instant his eyes opened. I reached into my pocket and felt the thin red string against my fingertips. The metal tip pressed lightly, almost like a quiet hello from yesterday. He said today finally felt like the right day. No excuses left. I nodded because his voice carried a certainty I hadn't heard before. And for a moment, I believed it too. We walked toward the gate with serious faces, trying to look like people on an important mission. Halfway there, he stopped abruptly and stared ahead. He whispered that the street looked different from yesterday. Maybe the shadows had shifted, or the air smelled older. I looked hard but saw only the same cracked sidewalk and familiar trees. Still, his words planted a tiny seed of doubt. So we stood there watching, waiting for something to prove him right or wrong. A gray cat crossed the road and paused to stare at us with unblinking eyes. He said animals always notice things before humans do. I studied the cat, hoping it would give us a sign. It scratched its ear once, then patted away without hurry. He nodded solemnly. Suspicious. Very suspicious. I didn't see anything suspicious, but I trusted his instinct anyway. It felt safer than doubting. We continued to the corner and stopped at the familiar stone. The yellow house waited under the sun, curtains still drawn, silent as ever. He narrowed his eyes like a detective in the stories we loved. "The silence means something big is happening," he said. I listened with all my might, but heard only a single bird calling from far away. He raised one finger. "Wait, we shouldn't arrive at a strange moment." I asked what made a moment strange. He said we'd know it when it came. The air would feel wrong. That sounded wise, so I stood very still beside him. We watched the door as if it might suddenly speak or sigh. After a minute, he sighed and shook his head. "Not yet. The moment hasn't arrived." I asked when good moments usually showed up. He said they preferred late afternoon, when everything felt softer. That matched what he'd said before about doors and manners. So we turned back, agreeing to return later with perfect timing. The rest of the afternoon passed in small, absorbing ways. We built a road for ants out of twigs and pebbles. The key lay beside us on the grass like a patient guest. Every time the red string caught my eye, the task floated back into my mind. But each time it returned, he found another gentle reason to wait. Important deliveries, he said, needed excellent conditions, air that felt friendly, a street that looked welcoming, shoes that felt confident. I rubbed my sneakers against the grass until they shone a little. He inspected them like a strict teacher grading homework. "Better," he said, "but not perfect yet." I asked how shoes learn confidence. "From patient waiting," he answered. It sounded deep and true, so I believed him. Then the ice cream truck's bell rang from the end of the block, sweet, insistent, impossible to ignore. We looked at each other, eyes wide. Without a word, we dropped everything and ran toward the sound. We bought cones, chocolate for him, strawberry for me, and ate them slowly on the curb, licking drips from our wrists, talking about nothing important. The key stayed forgotten in my pocket, while the cold sweetness filled our mouths and the afternoon melted around us. The sun slid lower. Shadows stretched long and thin across the pavement. He glanced at the sky and frowned. We might be slightly late now. A small worry tapped my chest. I asked if slightly late was very bad. Not bad, he said, but delicate. We decided to hurry before delicate turned terrible. He marched ahead. I guarded the key like a treasure. When we reached the yellow house gate, we froze. A white paper was taped to the front door. It swayed gently in the warm breeze. He grabbed my arm and whispered, "New information. Signs," he said, "always meant big situations. Sometimes families disappeared without warning." I stared at the paper. It looked official, calm, certain of itself. We stepped closer with careful detective steps. The note said the house was empty now. The family had moved away this morning. He read it twice, blinking slowly. I counted the words to make sure they were real. The red string brushed my wrist, soft as a sigh. Neither of us knocked. He spoke in a softer voice than I'd ever heard. This morning came very quickly. I said we had almost come very quickly too. We stood there holding a key that belonged to nobody anymore. The street stayed calm, indifferent. Even the curtains no longer seemed to wait. I felt something strange settle inside me, heavy yet gentle, like a stone smoothed by years of water. It wasn't trouble. It wasn't fear. It was a lesson that arrived without a teacher, quiet and final. He looked at the key, then at me. We probably still had time this morning. I nodded because that felt exactly right. We walked home slower than we had ever walked before. The key no longer tapped against my leg. It rested quietly, as if it understood everything we didn't. We didn't argue. No one blamed anyone. The road looked the same, but it felt different now. Wider, emptier, strangely familiar. Years later, whenever I pass an old key in a drawer or see a quiet yellow house with drawn curtains, this memory returns without warning. It doesn't hurt anymore. It simply arrives, gentle as afternoon light, reminding me how easily the smallest things slip away when we think there will always be tomorrow.